The snowstorm howled on the peak of Thuong Cuc, known as the roof of the world, the natural boundary dividing the continent's two most powerful empires. Amidst the vast whiteness and the biting cold, a figure slowly advanced to the mountain summit. It was Hach Lien, the invincible great general of the north. His hair was tinged with silver, the scars across his face a testament to a life of brushing with death, trampling over 10,000 corpses to expand the borders. Today he did not bring his tens of thousands of armored cavalry, nor did he wear his majestic armor. On his back, he only carried a bundle of dry pine firewood, a few animal pelts, and a heavy black iron sledgehammer. The mountain peak was a barren flat surface, the permafrost as hard as metal. Hach Lien took off his pack, using his rough bare hands to carefully arrange the animal pelts. He swung the sledgehammer high, delivering thunderous blows to the ice surface to create small holes. The deafening sound of the sledgehammer echoed through the silent space, shattering the thick ice and sharp hidden rocks. Using the most rustic survival and building skills forged through countless harsh campaigns, he used the sledgehammer to drive pine stakes deep into the rocky bed, erecting a semicircular windbreak wall, relying on the terrain of the cliff rather than resisting the power of the blizzard. In the middle of the neat space just erected, he used a flint to strike a fire, kindling a small but persistent flame amidst the desolate freezing cold. Just as the fire blazed brightly, from the other side of the cliff, another figure appeared. Lien, the supreme commander of the south, stepped forward with the calm demeanor of one who held the power of life and death over millions of souls. For the past 30 years, Hach Lien and Lien were two irreconcilable extremes. They had set up countless ruthless geopolitical chess games, incited proxy wars in smaller nations, manipulated military alliances, and sown chaos just to fight over every inch of land, every strategic trade route. They had never met, yet they understood each other's minds better than anyone else. Today, in their twilight years, when both empires were standing at the pinnacle of prosperity, yet decaying from within, they decided to meet at the highest place in the mortal world, carrying no weapons, only a jiangqi, Chinese chessboard. Lien sat down on the animal pelt opposite Hach Lien, giving a slight nod of greeting. From his knapsack, he took out an agarwood chessboard polished smooth by time, along with chess pieces carved from white jade ivory and black obsidian. They placed the chessboard on a flat rock between them, the flickering fire illuminating the intersecting lines just like the world map they had carved up and divided. "I thought you would bring an ambush," Lien spoke first, his voice deep and hoarse, picking up a black cannon piece and placing it on the board. Hach Lien smiled, using a branch to poke the fire. "At this age, I suddenly realized that commanding tens of thousands of troops is not as difficult as carrying firewood yourself and lighting a fire to keep warm on a winter night. You see, we have spent our whole lives building solid fortresses, soaring city walls. But ultimately, the only thing keeping our lives going right now is a primitive and rustic windbreak corner like this." The chess game began. The first moves were slow but full of probing. Lien pushed a pawn forward, evoking memories of the plain encirclement campaign 10 years ago, where he had used thousands of soldiers as bait to cut off the North's supply line. Hach Lien responded with a sharp knight move, exactly like how his cavalry once tore through the enemy's flank in the dead of night. On the chessboard, every movement carried the shadow of political schemes, bloody massacres, and the withering of dynasties. "Do you remember the small nation located in the Perfume River Valley?" Lien said, while launching a chariot to sweep through the opponent's defense. 20 years ago, wanting to seize the ore mine there, you and I pulled the strings for a civil war to break out. That nation was wiped out. Tens of thousands of people became wandering souls of the desert. At that time, I thought I had won. But that ore mine eventually ran dry after only 10 years, Hach Lien replied, using a cannon for cover, setting up a counter-defensive formation. The citadel that your southern army took such pains to build on it is now just a ruin buried by sand and dust. We act in the name of the empire's glory, in the name of the nation's greatness, but in reality, we are only satisfying our own bottomless thirst for power. Power is like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you get. The howling of the wind outside the pine wall grew fiercer. The blizzard had completely enveloped the Thuong Cuc peak. Had it been their younger years, perhaps they would have lunged at each other, fighting to the death to prove who was the true ruler. But now, amidst the bone-chilling cold, every title, every rank, every dazzling medal became meaningless. The throne in the distant capital could not radiate warmth. Tens of thousands of loyal soldiers could not stop the approaching footsteps of death that came with age. The chess game lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. The pieces were captured one by one, removed from the stone board, falling like the lives that had perished due to the ambitions of the two men. On the board now, only the two bare generals remained, besieged by a few battered pawns. Neither could unleash the final killing blow. The game was in a stalemate, exactly like the situation of the two empires, vast, exhausted, and unable to swallow each other whole. Loi Tan stared at the gaping chessboard, then burst into loud laughter. The laughter carried a sense of tragic heroism and bitter irony. A whole lifetime of fighting, deep calculation, destroying so many lords and ministers, and finally on the chessboard, only this emptiness remains. We pride ourselves on being outstanding chess players, manipulating the world, yet we forget that we ourselves are merely chess pieces on the chessboard of creation. Hach Lien nodded, picking up a cup of boiled melted snow to take a sip. Born empty-handed, using the blood and bones of tens of thousands to build a throne. And when closing our eyes in death, that throne cannot be taken along. The law of nature is inherently very fair. Every empire, no matter how mighty, will eventually decline. All power will eventually vanish into dust. Only this eternal rocky mountain and these blizzards will continue to exist forever, regardless of who claims to be king or hegemon. The two emperors looked at each other, no longer holding hatred, no longer on guard, leaving only the mutual understanding and sorrow of those who had reached the absolute limits of desire. Lloydon gently swept his hand, knocking over the entire chessboard. The jade pieces rolled onto the stone floor, blending into the pristine white snow. No more playing. In this chess game, there is no winner, nor is there a loser. Only impermanence is eternal, Lloydon said, picking up a dry pine branch and throwing it into the fire. The next morning, when the blizzard had passed, the sun emerged, casting its brilliant golden rays upon the Thuong Cuc peak. The wooden windbreak wall still stood firmly. The fire had died down, leaving only faintly glowing embers. The empty stone chessboard lay in silence. The two great figures had left at some unknown time, each going in a different direction, returning to his own empire. No one knew what else they had said, only that after that meeting, all weapons of war between the two nations were ordered to be recalled. Military outposts were dismantled, making way for trading markets. Later generations still passed down the tale of a legendary chess game on the roof of the world, where two fierce beasts learned how to let go of their fangs and claws. They realized that the greatest victory was not planting one's flag on another's territory, but planting peace within one's own soul, a soul once filled with greed, anger, and ignorance. Because when the game ends, whether a majestic general or a lowly pawn, all are put away together into the same narrow wooden box of life's twilight. 10 years since the historic chess game on the peak of Thuong Cuc, the landscape of the continent had completely transformed. There were no longer war horns tearing through the night sky, nor bloody sieges ravaging smaller nations. The two mighty empires had retreated their troops, and the fiercely guarded military outposts were dismantled, making way for the bustling trade routes of northern and southern merchants. Hach Lien, the great general who once sowed terror on horseback, had now retired from his official duties. He refused all royal privileges, shedding his gold-plated armor to don the worn rough cloth of a woodcutter. Rather than immersing himself in wealth and glory in his twilight years, he chose to return to Tish Lu, the primeval forest situated right on the old borderline, a place that was once the mass grave of tens of thousands of fallen soldiers during the cruel geopolitical conflicts of the past. Locals in the region whispered chilling tales about Tish Lu. They said that on nights with thick fog, one could still hear the clash of swords, the neighing of horses, and the mournful wails of countless wandering souls unable to transcend, lingering around the moss-covered ancient trees. But Hach Lien was not afraid. More than anyone else, he understood that the most terrifying demons do not hide in the cold fog, but reside within the boundless ambition and greed of humanity. To help merchant caravans safely cross the forest, Hach Lien decided to spend the rest of his life building rest stops. He applied the most rustic survival and building skills he had accumulated through countless harsh campaigns. Without relying on local authorities or a massive crew of masons, Hach Lien worked entirely alone. His only weapon now was not the dragon blade that once beheaded generals and captured flags, but a heavy black iron sledgehammer. Every day he wandered in search of fallen ironwood and redwood tree trunks brought down by storms. He swung the sledgehammer into the air, delivering solid blows to the wooden wedges to split the trunks lengthwise. The deafening sound of the sledgehammer echoed through the silent great forest, shattering the hidden rocks that blocked the path. But strangely, the sound of the sledgehammer no longer carried the murderous intent of coercion or destruction. It was the sound of patience and creation. Hach Lien meticulously carved and shaped, using primitive mortise and tenon joinery techniques, so that the rafters and columns automatically locked tightly into one another without the need for a single iron nail. These open-sided pavilions rose amidst the dangerous haunted forest, yielding to the wind of the mountain cliffs, humble yet sturdy against all tempests. One late dusk, as Hach Lien was kindling a small fire inside a newly completed rest stop, the fog outside suddenly shifted. From the gloomy darkness of the forest of lost souls, a gigantic creature slowly stepped out. It was an incredibly old white elephant, its gray, wrinkled skin marked with a crisscross of scars from time and war. The most striking detail was that both sides of the elephant's mouth were bare, completely devoid of tusks. The rough scars at the base showed that its proud tusks had been stripped away a long time ago, perhaps to serve the vain pleasures or as a trophy for some powerful figure. Yet this flawed old elephant did not appear maddened or harbor any overwhelming resentment. It calmly used its powerful trunk to part the dry leaves, making its way to the small stream to drink. Afterward, it quietly plucked tender blades of grass to chew, its eyes looking at Hach Lien with an incredibly gentle and serene gaze. Looking at the white elephant, Hach Lien instinctively let his hands drop the sledgehammer's handle, a wave of shame washing over him, yet accompanied by profound tranquility. That majestic animal had been robbed of its greatest weapon of self-defense and the highest pride of its kind. But it did not resent the great forest, nor did it frantically trample everything in its path over the loss. It accepted its flawed body, kept its mind untethered by what was lost, and continued to live in harmony with heaven and earth. He murmured, "True letting go is not throwing everything away. But when stripped of the most precious things, we can still smile and keep walking." He suddenly realized that this tuskless elephant, and he himself, a general who had personally broken his own military authority, were walking the exact same path of liberation. A few months later, a caravan of merchants from the south traversed the Teach Lu forest. Leading the caravan was an old man in coarse cloth, his hair tied in a high bun, his face radiating a leisurely aura. It was Lien. Two former enemies, two former kings of the geopolitical chessboard, now met again under the rustic wooden porch built by Hach Lien's own hands. They no longer had military escorts, nor territories to fight over. Lien unstoppered a gourd of fermented black sticky rice wine, pouring it into two rough wooden bowls. The flickering fire illuminated the wrinkles on their foreheads, warm and solitary. Lien took a sip of the hot wine, directing his gaze out into the fog. This forest used to be rife with resentment, but passing through today, I only hear the singing of birds and the babbling of the stream. Did you use that sledgehammer to tap out the rhythm of salvation for the wandering souls? Hach Lien burst into laughter, tossing another dry pine branch into the fire. "I haven't saved anyone, Brother Loi. I only built empty spaces for the wind to slip through, for the living to have a place to rest. When the living no longer carry their resentment and ambitions into the great forest, the resentment of the dead will naturally dissipate." The two men cast their gaze far into the distance, where the tuskless elephant was slowly strolling under the moonlight. It used its trunk to wrap around a fern, its demeanor unhurried and free. Human life is like a long dream, Hach Lien said thoughtfully, his voice blending with the rustling leaves. When we are young, we yearn to grow the sharpest tusks, straining ourselves to carry the burden of power, face, and greed, only to gore each other bloody on the chessboard of fame and fortune. But look, an animal that has lost its greatest weapon can still live peacefully amidst the storm. The highest realm of human life is not possessing a peerless weapon to subjugate the world, but having enough courage to manually remove our own tusks of ambition. Lien nodded, lifting his bowl of wine to gently clink against Hach Lien's. The dull thud of wood striking wood resonated like a perfect epilogue to the epic of war and peace. Life, in the end, is not a chess game to be won or lost. It is a long journey for each person to realize the illusion of solid walls, to learn how to open one's heart like an empty, partitionless pavilion, ready to embrace the blizzards of impermanence without fear or complaint. The next morning, when the first bird songs awoke the dark fog of Tichlú, Lien did not step into his carriage to continue his journey south. He summoned the caravan manager, handing over all his seals, wealth, and command. Why return south when my true throne remains in this haunted forest? Lien smiled, taking off his expensive silk robes and putting on a piece of rough burlap scavenged from an old knapsack. He turned his back, walking to the wooden porch where Hach Lien was using a machete to split kindling. From that day on, the Tichlú forest forever lost the two most powerful emperors of the continent, gaining instead two patient old woodcutters. They did not discuss state affairs, nor did they mention their glorious battles. Their lives shrank down to the most primitive survival skills, carrying firewood together, foraging for mushrooms, building fires, and filtering spring water. Their shared weapon now was only a heavy black iron sledgehammer. There were days when Hach Lien and Lien took turns swinging that sledgehammer to smash wooden wedges, splitting in half an ancient tree that had just fallen in a storm. The striking of the sledgehammer no longer carried the battle cry, but blended into the echoing rhythm of the great forest, bit by bit constructing rain shelters that were completely open, with no partitions, welcoming the wind from all directions. That summer, a once-in-a-millennium great flood poured down into the Tichlú Valley. Water from upstream rushed down, muddy and turbulent, carrying a roaring destructive power, as if wanting to swallow everything. From the high mountain slope, Hach Lien and Lien stood silently observing nature's wrath. Down in the valley, the ruins of solid brick and stone fortresses, remnants of border wars from the past, were quickly smashed, pulverized, and washed away without a trace by the aggressive floodwaters. The more the walls tried to stand against the water, the more they were crushed to pieces by the flood. However, the wooden rest stops built by the two old men suffered a different fate. Because there were no solid walls, the floodwaters easily surged through the empty spaces between the pillars. The wooden mortise and tenon structures were not nailed dead with iron, but had flexible clearance. So when the fierce water slammed into them, the entire wooden frame merely trembled, twisting and yielding to the flow. When the flood receded, though covered in thick mud, those rustic pavilions still stood proud and tranquil. Lien looked at the scene and sighed in admiration. He who stubbornly raises his guard to resist will lose everything. He who knows how to be tolerant, empty, and let go can contain the very power of heaven and earth. The great flood also washed away all the shattered bones and rusty spears of tens of thousands of fallen soldiers buried beneath Tichlú, sweeping them all out to the vast ocean. The old forest finally completed its process of cleansing the resentment, sweeping away the remnants of human ambition. On an early winter night, the cold began to weave through the dry leaves. Under the silvery moonlight, the tuskless elephant slowly walked to the two old men's campfire. Its body was now emaciated, its sagging wrinkles carrying the weariness of the mortal realm. It knelt its two front legs on the damp ground, using its trunk to wrap around a dry fern branch and placing it before Hach, Lien, and Lien, like a final farewell. Then it quietly lay down, tightly closed its gentle eyes, and let out a long, peaceful breath that dissolved into the night mist. No resentment, no pain. The two former emperors did not shed a single tear. They sat beside the body of the old elephant, silently keeping the eternal vigil for their wordless friend. Look, Hach said softly. In the past, our armored war elephants, fitted with golden tusks, roared on the battlefield, but ultimately all died in tragedy amidst arrows and bullets. Meanwhile, this flawed, tuskless creature, because it carried no weapon to kill or to boast, was able to live its entire life in ultimate peace. The next morning, they did not dig a grave. They gathered pine seeds and scattered them around that massive body. The old forest would embrace it, turning the flesh and blood of imperfection into nutrients to nurture the young green leaves reaching for the sunlight. Decades later, the rustic rest stops in Tiklu had been covered by moss and vines, merging into one with the great forest. No one knew when Hach, Lien, and Loiton had passed away. No graves were erected, no stone steles recorded the feats or identities of the two illustrious emperors. They came to this world with cries thirsting for power, using blood and tears to reach the pinnacle. But when they left, they chose to dissolve into the thick fog of the deep forest, leaving behind no trace other than the empty spaces under the wooden porches to shelter stranded travelers. The final philosophy they left behind was not found in military treatises or heroic epics. It lay in the rustling of the forest leaves, in the babbling of the stream, and in the eternal silence of all things. Human life, after all, is just a brief rest stop in the endless flow of time. Do not try to build solid walls to imprison your own shadow. Live like an abandoned pavilion with no walls, arriving bare, departing freely, opening your heart for the storms to blow through, and smiling as you watch all attachments turn to dust. Hundreds of years had quietly passed since the day Hach, Lien, and Loiton transformed into wisps of fog in the great forest of Tiklu. The wheel of time did not stop turning because of their enlightenment. Subsequent generations were born, grew up, and continued to forget the costly lessons their forefathers had paid for with blood and tears. New empires rose again from the ashes. Borders were redrawn through massacres. The thirst for domination once again clouded the reason of humanity. History simply repeated itself like a tedious but deeply tragic play. Around this time, a rumor suddenly emerged among the commoners of the north. At the heart of the deadly Tiklu forest, where the two greatest former emperors in history once lived in seclusion, a treasure was hidden. Whoever found that treasure would possess the ultimate military treatise and the power to unify the world. Mesmerized by the illusion of power, countless adventurers, generals, and notorious executioners flocked into the Tiklu forest. But the old forest had laid out nature's traps. Miasma, swamps, wild beasts, and sudden forest storms swallowed most of them. Only one person managed to reach the core of the great forest. It was Kohan. Kohan was a young warrior, carrying a hardened heart and a burning ambition. He did not believe in gods, nor did he fear demons. His gear was extremely pragmatic: dry rations, drinking water, and a giant cold steel sledgehammer. He used to use that sledgehammer to smash the city gates of his enemies, crushing the armor of those who stood in his way. For Kohan, absolute violence and power were the keys to solving every obstacle in the world. On a misty, foggy afternoon, Kohan set foot in a clearing. Contrary to the dense gloom of the forest outside, this place was strangely quiet and airy. Standing out in the middle of the grass was a giant pine tree, its lush branches and leaves reaching up to shade an entire corner of the sky. Beneath the pine canopy lay the ruins of a rustic wooden pavilion, completely devoid of walls, leaving only the time-faded pillars tightly wrapped in vines. Kohan's eyes lit up brightly. He firmly believed that the treasure hidden by the two emperors lay beneath the floor of this pavilion. He took down the sledgehammer from his back, braced himself, swung it up, and delivered a thunderous blow to the stone floor. Clang! The deafening sound rang out, tearing through the silence of the great forest. The stone slab cracked wide open, but beneath it lay only humus and tree roots. Kohan did not give up. He continued to swing his hammer madly, smashing every stone, churning up the entire foundation of the pavilion. The sound of his sledgehammer rang out with murderous intent, carrying the destruction and bottomless greed of man. By the time the sun began to set, Kohan was exhausted. His hands were bleeding, his breathing ragged. The pavilion floor had been plowed by him into a pile of rubble, but there was absolutely no treasure, No military treatise, no jewel-encrusted sword whatsoever. Only dirt, sand, and emptiness. Just as Kohan was screaming in fury and despair, a dull sound echoing from the edge of the forest startled him into gripping his sledgehammer handle tightly. From the hazy fog, a herd of elephants slowly stepped out. Kohan froze, his pupils dilating in astonishment. Unlike the giant war elephants with sharp tusks he had seen on the battlefield, this entire herd, from the massive alphas to the calves chirping as they followed their mothers, were all completely devoid of tusks. The corners of their mouths were smooth, gentle, and harmless. The elephant herd paid no attention to Kohan's presence or his blood-stained sledgehammer. They leisurely approached the giant pine tree, the tree that had sprouted from the corpse of the tuskless elephant hundreds of years ago. They reached out their trunks to pick up fallen pine cones, rubbing their wrinkled backs against the tree trunk like a ritual of gratitude to their origins. The scene unfolded with profound tranquility and harmony, exuding a strangely peaceful vitality. Kohan stood motionless. He was a predator, but facing a herd of elephants with no defensive weapons, he suddenly felt his strength become ridiculous and superfluous. If this herd of elephants had carried precious tusks, perhaps they would have been slaughtered by humans long ago. But that very flaw was their most perfect shield. No tusks meant breeding no greed in others. No tusks meant creating no reason to be hunted. Their survival through the centuries in this forest was proof of a great law of nature. The strongest protection does not come from carrying the sharpest weapon, but from not posing a threat or inciting desire in anyone. He looked back at the sledgehammer in his hand. The hammer had helped him shatter countless city gates, but it could not help him shatter his own ignorance. He had used force to seek a treasure that did not exist, only to turn himself into a slave to ambition. In that moment, the forest wind blew through the open-sided pavilion. The rustling sounds of the pine leaves seemed to whisper into Kohan's ears, the testament of the two former emperors from the past. He who stubbornly raises his guard to resist will lose everything. He who knows how to be tolerant, empty, and let go can contain the very power of heaven and earth. The treasure of Tikhlu had never been gold, silver, or military strategy. That treasure was emptiness. The emptiness of the wall-less pavilions, the emptiness at the corners of the tuskless elephants' mouths, and the emptiness in the soul when a person is willing to put down the sledgehammer of resentment. The hardest trial for a warrior is not when he raises his weapon to kill, but when he has the courage to lay his weapon down. Kohan slowly loosened his blood-stained fingers. The black iron sledgehammer fell with a thud onto the muddy ground, forever buried beneath the rotting leaves. He knelt before the base of the ancient pine tree, tears rolling down his face, calloused by wind, dew, and meaningless battles. In the days that followed, Kohan did not return to the north. He used his bare hands to pick up every stone, every piece of wood he had smashed himself. He imitated the primitive woodworking methods of his predecessors, using no iron nails, no sledgehammer, only patience to piece together the wooden joints, restoring the rain shelter for lost travelers. Many more decades passed. The empires outside continued to rise and fall, but the Tikhlu forest forever maintained its peace. The tuskless elephants still leisurely strolled under the shade of the pine, and occasionally woodcutters venturing deep into the forest would come across a silver-haired old man, dressed in coarse cloth, sitting in meditation before an open-sided pavilion. No one knew his name, nor did anyone care that he was once a notorious warrior. The story of reincarnating human life never ends, but its philosophy is always present in every corner of heaven and earth. We frantically swing sledgehammers to smash the world, hoping to find a pearl of eternity. But only at the end of life do we bitterly realize that the pearl was always in the wholeness of the world before we swung the hammer. Human life is like a tightly clenched fist. The harder you squeeze, the more air slips through your fingers. Only when you open your hand can you embrace the entire sky.